This is my introductory lecture on natural resource and ecosystem management in transformation countries. Personally, I came across the term transformation country after 2006, when it was the first time I traveled to Ukraine, a country that was supposed to be a transformation country. This was in the year 2006. We took a bus and traveled together with students from Germany eastwards to the center of Europe. This was a remarkable trip. We noticed that we were pretty ignorant regarding the life and the situation of this relatively young country, which used to exist behind the Iron Curtain. It was kind of a trip back in time with, well, lifestyles and land use that we could not observe anymore in Western Europe. We witnessed people being very proud of, their nature, where culture was an integrated part of, the wider ecosystem, and of course, beyond superficial impressions that could lead to romantic perceptions, it was clear that people dependent on ecosystem services. That the economic situation was very critical, and obviously, people were struggling with getting the resources they needed for having a good life. Over the years, traveling to Ukraine regularly, it was clear that something happened in the country. Of course, changes always happen, and there was a transformation in some parts of the country, and with regard to some elements such as, new types of houses popping up, obviously indicating new resources being available. So yes, a country in transformation, but what does it mean? Does it mean like how people live, or what is transformed actually? Is it the daily life? Is it politics? Is it the economy? Yes, many new things happened, where formerly there were remote and lonesome valleys in the Carpathians. New holiday resorts were built up, skiing resorts such as Bukovel here on this picture, and also in the cities it became evident that prosperity, at least, of some, led to, modernization in a country which clearly was struggling with economic troubles. So what is a transformation country? Before really coming back to that question, I would like to, go back in history and understand where transformation countries were coming from, and for which countries actually this word was used for the first time. We take a short trip through history using this interactive world history atlas, which is very interesting, allows for traveling through thousands of years and seeing the evolution of territories. Here we start in the year 1870, in the time when there were, empires in Western Europe and, Central Europe, such as the Ottoman Empire, Habsburg Empire, Prussian Empire, also, the English Empire at that time, controlling colonies abroad as much as other countries such as France. And if we then move on another decade, we see that the map is ever changing, with the German Empire being founded, for example, and well, in the colonies, borders slowly and steadily uh, being changed all the time. 1910, 1920, and what we see here, well, there are more territories rising here for the first time in the western part of the huge Russian territory. Ukraine appears on the map, a country which, well, will be a case study for our reflections on transformation countries. 1930, it disappeared again. It became part of the Soviet Union, and here we are now in the situation before the Second World War. Actually, the big empires had collapsed after the First World War, and it's easy to recognize that, well, change in history is bringing along abrupt and often very drastic changes to at least to certain territories, countries that then may undergo, yeah, what is it, a transformation, possibly. 1940, the situation now in the war, with Germany occupying other territories, um, and well, with the consequences that are well known, the disasters brought to Europe and the entire world. Come back to that in a few seconds. 1950 would be the situation after the Second World War, which is, well, the starting point of a new world order, new types of politics as well, internationalization becoming more relevant, the dramatic experience of the World War leading to strengthening efforts related to the United Nations and building up unions of states. In a way, well, the New World Order meant that there seemed to be different worlds: the first world, the Western developed countries, and the counterpart, the second world, with the communist countries. And as we know, well, these times were shaped by the competition and the conflict between the two blocs. And, well, countries that belonged then to the so-called third world uh, had the chance to, well, have contacts with the first or second world. Actually, it was about both blocs trying to control the rest of the world. This was a situation which was kept kind of stable for quite a while. If we move forward 1960, 1970, we see that in the, well, former colonies, ever more countries were becoming independent, and new national states were founded. In Europe, the situation being more or less stable until, well, then 1989, 1990, when the Soviet Union collapsed and the communist states decided to switch the political system as much as the economic system. So this was a big starting point for the transformation countries, as they were called, the countries that were released by the Second World, and where the expectation was that they would then automatically transform into developed countries, democratized countries, being part of the first world. At the same time, well, already in this moment, it was clear that it was impossible to speak about different worlds. It was one world. Also, well, this enormously important moment in history, well, some said it was the end of history. Now we know it wasn't. Um, Catalyzed new possibilities regarding international cooperation, and this had also relevant consequences, as we know, for environmental management with the Rio Earth Summit and so on and so forth. So this was a, well, turning point potentially where, well, many countries would have, well, seen the necessity to transform to, well, the countries, the mm, governance towards, well, more sustainable development. But first, well, we see here all the new countries in the periphery of the former Soviet Union, the Russian Federation, and while all these transformation countries in Central Asia and Eastern and Central Europe, including Ukraine, which became independent in 1991. If we look at, well, the history very briefly of this country, we recognize that it has been a very difficult um, history on the border between, well, Western Europe, Central Europe, and the East. Actually, Ukraine means borderland, the border between different, well, ecosystems as well, which made history. The border between the steppes and, well, the temperate forests and the mountains. Ukraine goes back to the Kievan Rus in the 9th century, which was a territory stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, which disintegrated in the 13th century. The territory came under Lithuanian and Polish control, was part of the Polish kingdom. There were some attempts of, yeah, forming a Ukrainian nation, at least, well, events such as the Cossack Rebellion in the 17th century would have to be analyzed in this context. Ukraine, as such, did not exist. The territory was divided between Poland and then also Russia. Later on, Austria had access to the territory. The Galicia was part of the Habsburg Empire. And in the Russian part of the territory, there was, in the 18th and also 19th century, a certain Russification, with times when the Ukrainian language also was abolished or prohibited. 1918 to 1920, it was a short period after the revolution, 1917, in Russia, when here as well a People's Republic was founded and, well, struggled for an independent existence, but there was the clear tendency of Russia wanting to control the development, and actually in 1922 Ukraine became the Soviet Republic of Ukraine. Dramatic events in the history refer in the 1930s to policies where actually Ukrainian farmers were forced to pay high grain levies, which was leading to hunger and, well, the so-called Holodomor was possibly, well, causing the death of 3.5 million Ukrainian farmers. And here the map shows like the concentration, especially in the red regions, where a high loss of people occurred, more than 25% in the dark red areas. Hardly recovered from this terrible, well, period. Germany started the Second World War and then also occupied Ukraine and established the Reichskommissariat Ukraine, destroying a center of Jewish culture. In a few years, well, almost the entire Jewish population, which was very important, especially in Western Ukraine, um, completely vanished. 6.5 to 7.5 million people were killed. More than 2 million Ukrainians were deported for forced labor. And this was, well, in another traumatic period in the history of this country. 1943 to 44, the Red Army was liberating Ukraine. Then for the first time, the different parts of Ukraine, including those that were formerly controlled by Austria or were part of Czechoslovakia, they all became, well, the Ukraine, again, the reunification, as it was called. The territory still was well, changing. Important event was the Crimea being given to Ukraine. And in 1991, as mentioned before, Ukraine gained independence with a complicated recent history with different governments, well, orienting themselves towards the east, towards Russia, or towards the European Union, and people were, well, various times going to the streets. The Orange Revolution led to, well, a change towards well, orientation towards Western Europe, actually, which was reversed later on under the government of the pro-Russian president Yanukovych, who was deposed by the famous Euromaidan movement in 2014. And then, well, actually, the last critical events and period started in 2014 when Russia was occupying Crimea, organized a referendum, took away the territory, and then later on also a war in eastern Ukraine was started, the so-called Donbass war, which, well, still goes on and also has claimed a lot of victims. So looking at such a history, the question becomes ever more complicated. What is a transformation country? If yeah, a transformation is a change from something to another state after an abrupt change. But yeah, what if, like, the entire history of a country is shaped by multiple ruptures and shocks? Obviously, well, this is something to be taken into account regarding the stability and the opportunities for transformation in such a country. Before we come back to Ukraine, I would like to um, talk about some more fundamental issues. So as we use this word transformation, the question is, what is it really? Where does it come from? And if we refer to transformation, well, this is a change process. Change is a more neutral or broad word, so we have to look at development is very much used in terms of positive change that countries strive for. Very often development seems to be a synonym of growth, something to be analyzed and questioned. And then there is also something like evolution, which is a directed change process. Change is something that is always happening in the universe. All the different entities that exist, all the systems change from one state to another, such as molecules here, um, in the course of chemical reactions, and this change is reversible. So often, well, some systems can switch back and forth from one state to another, and this might be related with input or output of energy. But it's completely neutral, and as I said, it might be more or less reversible. Definitely, it's about switching from one state of a system to another. A very intended change nowadays is growth, which is of course a directed change, a quantitative change towards more in a system, like more in terms of abundance, complexity, diversity, information in the system, the mass itself. Um, Development actually is something, well, possibly different also from the word itself. It means it's the opposite of the envelope. Develop, something is unpacked, unwrapped, actually discovering the potential of something that is already existing, the unfolding. Possibly a good example of such a development is the hatching of a butterfly, which is prepared, well, by the growth of a caterpillar. So actually growth, yes, can lead to the fact that something that is already programmed, that already exists, can start to exist. In biological life, we know the evolution is relevant, which is also an ongoing change process. It's a growth of diversity and complexity in life. It's a change in systems. It's a multiplication of systems, actually, very much related to growth as well. It's life adapting to changing conditions and changing opportunities. It's a process driven by selection, as we know, and it's directed. So actually, there's hardly a way back. Like once a change has occurred in evolution, it's not possible to get back to an earlier stage. It's directed in a form that we also observe ever more information being involved, as older information and the genetic material is stored and used and recombined, which leads to innovation, which leads to new opportunities for the system itself. But clearly it's open-ended, and it's not possible to define like where this process is leading to. It's highly depending on the external and internal change, but the innovation um, potential also is growing. So this is quite an interesting aspect of evolution. So we come to a transformation, which also formerly was used in biology, where it refers to, for example, in genetics, the fact that a certain cell can all of a sudden acquire new properties. Bacteria, for example, absorbing or taking up genetic material from another cell, integrating this new information into the own genome and acquiring pretty rapidly new properties. So a cell being transformed by genetic transfer, leading to an abrupt acquisition of properties. Here we have an externally induced process. It needs the input from outside. Transformation also is known in electronics. As we know, transformers are used for, well, transforming electricity from one type of voltage to another. In a way, transformation, well, is just changing something that is not entirely different afterwards, but then exists in another form. Very relevant also in the context of energy, which is transformed from one form to another, such as light energy, radiation energy absorbed by green plants, the chloroplasts, and then in the course of chemical reactions, the light energy being transformed to biochemical energy. So it's obviously still energy, but then also in a form that can be used differently, and that also changes the potential of the system that conducted or performed this transformation. In nature, as we know, we have complex systems, like different components interacting, and by interacting, creating new entities which acquire emergent properties. And in a way, this is also a process of transformation of different components becoming a bigger whole. So this systemic interaction induces existence, and also leads to the transformation of these systems. Complex system science, very relevant in the context of understanding problems of transformation and growth. And one of the most important studies, early 1970s, the limits to growth, were not only relevant as the first important piece of work criticizing, questioning the growth paradigm, but also applying complex system science to the world, and actually showing that different subsystems would not exist independently but interact, such as the human subsystem, the population, that would depend on other systems related to natural resource use, food production systems, industrial systems, and so on, but also climate system and functioning ecosystems. This was a very simple but first world model, which tried to model the performance of interdependent interacting systems. And what the model showed, like that if some systems grew a lot, such as the human population going into exponential growth due to changes in other systems, such as the food system or resource systems, a rapid loss of available resources would then lead to changes and turning points, actually. And here we have a peak population that was projected in one of the different scenarios, and where, of course, here beyond a turning point we would talk also about a transformation of a system. So turning points, tipping points, are definitely these points when transformation happens. by the way, as we know, like this was projected for different scenarios, and under any assumption, it was impossible to see scenarios where we had endless growth of the human population or food production or whatever. So we would see, like, after rapid growth, transformation would be inevitable. This is one of the important messages of the limits to growth. The question is how high the peak would be and how steep possibly, and at which moment it would come, but it's highly unlikely that transformation would not happen. Here in this model, which is extremely simple, due to very reduced calculation capacities, it's clear that transformation in systems happens due to interactions of the systems, and do not need to be steered or governed. So this is a relevant insight. Transformation, if the time comes, just happens. The changes of systems nowadays, we know, occur between certain discrete states that are more plausible, more viable for the system. Actually, often there is no in between, so it can have a certain state A or B, and systems would be stable if they were pushed, for example, by external disturbances up to a certain point, actually, when the system then goes into a non-linear change and reaching the new state. And this phase of non-linear, rapid, more or less rapid change is uncertain and is marking the tipping point. And as we have already mentioned, this transformation of a system from one state to another does not normally occur independently, but systems interact, and when various systems are driven to tipping points, this might lead to more pronounced reactions, synergetic reactions, and which can lead to surprising outcomes of such a transformation. Transformation, or in the social sciences, political sciences, tend to be seen in a more positive way, where actually, yes, it's also about a change from one system state to another, but where a system starts to develop and then actually more or less grows, has a breakthrough, and then would reach another stable phase, a stabilization phase. So often these processes are described by these sigmoid functions. As we know, systems not necessarily work like this, or actually if we look also at subsystems, whilst there's this rapid development and growth happens, there can be setbacks, at least in subsystems, and actually systems rather develop by being damaged, releasing some components, and rearranging all the time. So this is the idea of this adaptive cycle, which is indicated here, where systems can start a rapid growth, have a small reaching a plateau, and having a small break, stabilization phase, but then actually by external disturbance and forcings, there occurs a breakdown, a release of the components, which then can be rearranged, and so this um, adaptive cycle can lead to progress slowly and across different systems levels. This is a model that has been proposed by Holling, amongst others, and is called Panarchy, like the system, how systems are ruled across all scales, and how this change actually is self-organizing and dynamically and adaptively happening. So we summarize that transformation originally was used mainly in the natural sciences, but in the middle of the 20th century it was also adopted by political sciences, and this had quite a great resonance and appeal, and this was mainly related to Karl Polanyi, an economic sociologist who well developed the idea of the Great Transformation. And this was in the context of understanding how market economies or would evolve, or economies, and where there was this idea of natural and spontaneously developing free market economies, um, actually Polanyi showed that the change and development of economies also would be the outcome of a conscious and often violent intervention of the part of the government. Um, and the idea was stimulating, as it seemed possible to achieve a great transformation, to achieve radical and profound changes that also could be triggered politically. And so nowadays we again talk about this great transformation and mean this in a wider sense, not only in economic terms, but it's the idea of politically steering a big change of, the anthroposystem uh, towards a state which would be more sustainable. If we look at certain indicators that are relevant to transformation, such as democracy, um, it's possible to see and monitor the change in different countries. We have learned by doing this year after year that, the world is not functioning like that, so that less democratic countries become more democratic after a while, and at the end all the countries would be stable, have a democracy, and follow the approach of a free market economy. So rather we see that in some areas there is destabilization, and there is even a loss of democratic properties. Of course, we look at a world and different countries, which are not just countries, but which are comprising different subsystems, and also changing subsystems driven by technology, but also by population growth. And in some phases, actually, changes are happening more frequently in the systems. So here we have world citizens living under different political regimes, green would-be population in democracy, and then some transitional uh, types of ruling, going up to autocracy, and clearly non-democratic systems. And we see these well might increase as well, as much as democracy. Looking at statistics, interesting, there is a steep increase of democracies in the 20th century, with the curve flattening in a way, um, well, after the um, big event that caused that transformation countries became into the being, so like 1990 collapse of the Soviet Union, it's not automatically going onwards, and anyhow autocracies have been decreasing, but also maybe stabilizing now on a certain plateau. If we look at economic developments, the economic transformation, um, we would also see that, well, there is growth in prosperity and wealth. This is a map of the gross domestic product per capita in 1965. Mm, and we see a certain concentration in the first and second world, inverted commas, as they were called before, um, a concentration of yeah, economic activity, which was maintained over time, but also, yeah, we see more countries go into darker colors, which means more resources, a higher GDP per capita, but also, well, concentration processes. We see that here, 2010, um, the transformation of formerly communist countries happens economically, so they catch up in a way, at least some countries, especially if they became part of well, bigger unions such as the European Union, integrating former communist countries such as Poland, or Hungary, Slovakia, and so on. But here we see Ukraine not really catching up, not yeah, achieving this economic transformation as it was envisioned, possibly in the early 1990s. And well, this is true until today, and not only for Ukraine. There are other transformation countries where, at least economically speaking, also politically speaking, the transformation is slow or stagnating. So this possibly is a really important insight. Transformation is not automatically happening, and actually not inevitably uh, occurring for the better. So this has been seen, actually looking at the example of the transformation countries, and we know that democratization and modernization processes can fail, um, and possibly, yeah, we should have a more realistic view at political and economic systems and others, uh, using the systemic perspective, and where we know that there is no certain and predetermined path, but that, yeah, actually integrity and functionality of systems is constantly being challenged by external disturbances and also internal change. And, well, transformation can happen if countries can develop mechanisms that cushion disturbances, and can, well, help them to deal with crisis, and maybe even become stronger after crisis than before. And this is very much related to capacities of flexible adaptation and rearrangement. So really being able to go through the adaptive cycles. Summarizing also what we've learned so far about transformation in different countries. So we know transformations happen. They hardly have been planned. They theoretically can be governed, but often they are spontaneous, a result of complex systemic processes. And anyway, like, not all subsystems would equally follow the same um, pace of transformation, and this can also lead to internal ruptures, conflicts, and so not necessarily all transformations would be peaceful. Anyway, transformation in the context of politics and social systems, they describe a very comprehensive change in the structure, the organization of the systems, the functioning of decision making, and well, that is something that happened all the time. There are many historical examples, such as the shift from feudal agrarian to capitalist and urban society. And in a way, we have seen a lot of transformations in human history, which well, remind us a little bit rather evolution rather than in undirected change that can be reversed. So actually the cultural evolution, political evolution is happening, and where the innovations, once they exist, will help to, well, develop properties in the systems that mean that these systems cannot easily go back to the same state they had before. Mm, Relevant issue is that transformations often are beset by crisis or conflict, and this also means that they often provoke resistance. It's about yeah, existing values, traditions, lifestyles that are called into questions, and it's always about power. So under transformation in social systems, it's normal that new power constellations emerge, and so also there are counteracting forces um, that become relevant. The distributional conflicts also can mean that well, the erections within the system will have an impact on the transformation processes. So often then these processes can be um, faster, or actually they can be slowed down. If we have a perception of nested systems, we know like what we have as human system, as the anthroposystem. It's comprising manifold nested and interacting systems. There are four key types which actually especially interact and also compete for power and resources. The state systems, the civil society, and the market systems, and then to a certain extent also antisocial and criminal systems. And in a way, what we see as history, as an outcome or development, it's a lot related to the struggle of these um, not necessarily antagonistic, but competing systems that struggle with each other. And well, especially stable and functional system would mean that actually the the systems are not only resistant against external shocks and resilient after crisis, but very relevant is the consistency or coherence, that the different subsystems work together and also support the systems of the higher order, the overall system. So ideally, subsystems contribute to the stability of society, and also, well, there's this system around everything, like which is carrying the anthroposystem. It's the ecosystem. So we have to talk about ecosystems and ecosystem management under transformation. What does it mean to ecosystems, which in a way also, well, experience transformation um, at a slower or faster pace. A forest ecosystem as a self-organizing, dynamically adaptive system. Of course, here we have the adaptive cycles as well being relevant, which also, well, allow to a certain extent to adapt and respond to external shocks, which now have become more frequent under human pressure. And here we have some pictures which relate to forest use in Ukraine, and where we know, okay, land use always existed or for a long time and had its impact on the systems, even before the last relevant political change, before 1990. So there were uh, yeah, relevant forestry operations in Austro-Hungarian times, and the Carpathians, for example, when many of these spruce plantations were established. Mm, the relative poverty and lack of access to resources in Ukraine as a transformation country partly has led maybe to a reduced degradation, in a way that infrastructure was not developing so fast, that machines were less effective, um, difficult to assess so far. Of course, there has also been a lot of degradation due to unregulated use, illegal logging in the context of forestry. So it's sometimes difficult to see like what is more problematic. Clearly, we have in the last decades seen a lot of degradation and also irreversible loss of natural potential in ecosystems, and also environmental problems caused by that, such as severe flooding events that also were caused by deforestation in the high mountains, floodings with also socioeconomic costs, as we can see here, a bridge which was lost uh, in Transcarpathia. The transformation period from communist Soviet Republic to Ukraine also meant that land use um, was not intensifying for a long time. Actually, in vast areas, it became more extensive nature, claiming back areas with succession, and some landscapes showing features that could not be found anywhere in Western Europe, at least outside protected areas, like with shrublands and high coverage of these growing woods, extensive pastures. Anyhow, the traditional system actually in agriculture, especially around settlements and so on, is pretty diverse and was maintained until recently, like a patchwork of different um, agricultural products being cultivated, and a lot of fallow land not permanently underused. So this is completely different from the situation in Western Europe, where we have intensive land use, permanent use of all lands, high inputs of pesticides, fertilizers, which cannot be accessed or could not be accessed here in Ukraine for a long time, leading to a much better, much higher environmental quality and higher biodiversity all over. Still, this is changing as well. So yes, this is part of the transformation, access to global food markets, investors investing in land and applying modern technology, industrialized agriculture, uh, well, growing in the country. And so this is, well, again, reminding us that transformation not automatically is leading to the better, to at least of everything. So this might be good for economic development, but very harmful for the ecological fundament. This also refers to other types of investments, such as building skiing resorts here with damages for forest ecosystems, soils, and so on. Um, and yeah, and also having consequences for the human well-being and well, even the situation of the investments that might be threatened by environmental disasters and so on. So the transformation also would imply the growing awareness of these problems and the growth of environmental regulation. The question is whatever is faster, the degradation of the ecosystems or the attempts of protection. Clearly, we have to acknowledge, even under the most difficult circumstances, in the most difficult times in Ukraine, there were always actors investing in conservation, establishing protected areas such as biosphere reserves, here the Rostochka Biosphere Reserve, and preserving uh, very relevant and large ecosystems, pretty unique nowadays in Europe because they were lost, uh, well, in the course of former transformation, or was it development of industrialized countries in Western Europe. There are further transformation processes that are triggered now by, mm, well, environmental change, indirectly caused by humans. Here we look at a beautiful landscape in the Carpathians, looking at the Petros mountain in the Marmaros massif with vast spruce forests. And this picture is about 10 years old. And what we saw in the last years, a very aggressive spread of dieback, of conifer forests related to climatic changes, very probable, and well, of course, bark beetles being the agents of ecosystem change. So here we have ecosystems that are also undergoing a transformation, which impact also the socioeconomic systems. Ukrainian forestry in the Carpathians depended on spruce, which sooner or later will hardly be available. And there are other species, well, trying to build up forests, like deciduous broadleaf species such as the beech. Um, so here we see a transformation which might be successful for the time being, but having implications for the social and socioeconomic systems. The interaction of this different systems, where we've been highlighting this various times, also risks, is something that is catching the attention finally also of non-ecological sectors. Here, important graph of the Global Risks Report 2020 of the World Economic Forum, which shows that different risks that exist to investors, human well-being, from the environmental realm, social, political, infrastructure realms, and so on, are all interconnected. And indeed, as we might see right now, well, uh, infectious diseases, the current corona pandemic, are not only affecting human health, but have impacts on well, national governance and social stability, and this rapidly translates into well, the network of risks and problems involving international governance, environmental governance, and so on and so forth. Um, and well, having this in mind, we can come to the end and talk about transformation management, which is so much needed, obviously, like achieving that certain systems come to a more sustainable state. But it becomes clear that this is not a, well, one-dimensional and linear process. The question is actually, yeah, where are um, systems going to, transformation countries? So that in over time there is a certain change, and this change, well, might lead to a certain situation according to different scenarios. And I guess it's very relevant to develop scenarios, future scenarios, and this is not about like where we should go only, but also uh, what plausibly and realistically happens. And a typical scenario would be the business as usual scenario, which often is problematic, as we know. If we just continue like that, as we're doing now, this will be problematic. There are also, well, worst case scenarios that might imply enormous magnitudes of change, and which shall be prevented. And this also is challenge of transformation management, to achieve that the worst case scenarios are avoided, and yeah, that we get kind of close to a wished um, situation. And then we see like the necessity for the active transformation management. Mm, Scenario planning is more common now, especially under environmental management. I remember the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, first part study published about 15 years ago. And it was interesting that this document came up with, well, four major scenarios for the world, for the development of the world, um, taking into account a systemic approach, looking at human well-being and poverty, and trying to understand what were the um, direct drivers of change and the indirect drivers of change, and how ecosystems were involved. So connecting uh, well, all these different change and transformation processes, and well, formulating discrete scenarios which were more like proactive, meaning really foreseeing a more active management, and then also more reactive scenarios where things just happened, and then countries would start to react by, well, cooperation or by conflict, and creating order from strength. So these four scenarios were narratives just to inspire in informed thinking about the future, um, like based on certain assumptions regarding um, yeah, major political decisions and directions, looking at technology, um, at the state of ecosystems, institutions, the markets, of course, and well, certain approaches to um, well, economy and state governance. Looking at different parameters and how they might change. And I think if we talk about transformation countries and want to understand where are they going, a similar approach can be useful to look at all the different parameters and subsystems that definitely make change in countries and that contribute to or hamper transformation. And yeah, here we are with the question, uh, well, what a transformation country is. We might have a certain idea, but we acknowledge that transformation is not an automatic and straightforward process. It's well, based on changes in all types of subsystems. And nowadays, transformation cannot be seen at all just as a political economic process that is well determined and that is well just implemented according to laws. We have a complex situation, especially with environmental change unfolding, the global change, the climate change alone being a huge challenge, and that might also trigger actually new transformations. And possibly we have to be realistic and not look only at countries such as Ukraine or Moldova or Romania as transformation countries, but acknowledge that we are all everywhere. All countries are transformation countries as much as they are all developing countries that have together achieve sustainable development goals. So here we connect also the terms. Transformation is needed to resist or adapt to global change and achieve sustainable development. Thank you.